we had secured something that was unprecedented in Native American history in this country, where 40 million acres and $1 billion, that compared to where we started. Mm-hmm. In some of our most ardent, powerful supporters back east, they were ready to read something a hell of a lot less than we got, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we knew what we were giving up. I mean, we were maybe getting 10% of our former land holdings, but still it was the biggest settlement ever in this country with the Native American people. We were doing more for the economic and capitalistic system than anybody ever remotely thought, right? And we weren't interested in that aspect. We had to get the land. That was what we were after. But of course, as a minority, you don't control the process. So but look what's happened. I mean, we had nothing to begin with. We barely owned a mechanic shop in those old days. And now here, all of a sudden, we have a key place in the economy up here in Alaska, which we would never have had without the settlement.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Willie Hensley. Willie was born in 1941 in Kotzebue, Alaska, and was raised to live the traditional way that his Inupiaq ancestors had lived for thousands of years. As a young adult, while he was away at college, his family home was sold for a bottle of whiskey and then bulldozed. This lit a fire in him to fight for Alaska land claims, and Willie was instrumental in the creation and passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. The story of ANCSA is front and center in Hensley's 2008 book, 50 Miles from Tomorrow, a memoir of Alaska and the real people. The year the book came out, it was a New York Times editor's choice. Willie was a founder of Nana Regional Corporation, served as a director for 20 years, and concluded his career there as president. He was also a founder of Manilac, the regional nonprofit representing the tribes in the Kotzebue region, and was involved in the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives, where he has served as executive director, president, and co-chair. He spent 10 years in the Alaska legislature, serving in both the House and the Senate. He served as the manager of federal government relations in DC for the Alyeska Pipeline Services Company. Willie is currently the chair and founding member of the First Alaskans Institute. He and his wife, Abby, live here in Anchorage. Willie Hensley, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
It is a great honor to have you here. I was telling someone in the hallway that I was going to be interviewing you today, and the woman said, "That's a name I don't hear that much anymore." And you know what? That's a tragedy. I think that folks all across Alaska need to hear your name and know who you are, but particularly folks working in the legislature who are working in Alaska today. If they do not know your story, they should learn your story. I've learned your story from reading your book, 50 Miles from Tomorrow, which I think came out in 2009.
2008.
2008. Mm-hmm. How long did it take you to write the book?
Oh, actually, a year and a half. But it took 4 years between the time I got the contract to when it actually got published. But I was probably the low man on the totem pole because I'd never written anything before.
Yeah, but I mean, it was like a New York Times book review editor's choice.
That was amazing because I got not only a book review, there was an article the same week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I got good coverage by the New York Times. But I could write a book about trying to write a book because I never remotely thought that I could write. It never was a part of my mentality. I was too busy trying to get things done to think about, trying to convey that. And also, there's also a cultural inhibition in a sense that a memoir is a little bit like patting
Look at all the good things I did.
Yeah, and so that's a no-no in our culture. If you're good at anything, it's not for you to talk about it. It's somebody else to mention. But I realized that, I'd collected books all my life about the Arctic and explorers, missionaries, language books, you name it. But most of the time they were not by non-natives who had no idea about our language and about our values, about our culture. And so I thought it was time to try to give our perspective. And so before I wrote, I actually called my members of my own family to let them know I was thinking about it, make sure they were on board. And the thing I was always worried about was whether our own people thought I was accurate, in portraying the picture, so to speak, of not only my own life, but the transitions that we were all going through. And so I've had very good response, from people.
You graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in 1966.
Yep.
And then you returned to Kotzebue.
Actually, I returned to Fairbanks. Yeah.
You returned to Fairbanks, and then you enrolled in grad school. And I want to talk about what you did in grad school, but I also want to talk about, because I think it's a very important moment, and I think it encapsulates the work that you started towards ANCSA, and that is you went back to Kotzebue and the family home had been bulldozed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In this case, like your family home had been there for over a generation. Your adopted grandfather had built the house, maybe. Mm-hmm. The idea that somehow your beloved adopted mother was essentially homeless when you went back to Kotzebue that time.
Yeah, I was too.
Yeah.
Actually, when I got started involved, in the land issue, and I actually, it's a long story, but I literally had no plan for my life. I never knew about careers per se. I felt sort of obligated to keep going to school, even though I had no vision of how that was going to help me or anybody else. But my mother was the one who really made the sacrifice when she allowed me to go to boarding school in Tennessee. And I was gone for 4 years, by the way.
And it was a non-native boarding school.
Oh, yeah. It was a religious school. Anyway, but, I never had a specific career type thing in mind. And because I was raised out in the country, actually, a hunter, fisher, trapper type, out there outside of Kotzebue. And But yes, I managed to get through boarding school. I got back to Fairbanks for a couple of years, and then I transferred to George Washington because I thought I was being pigeonholed as a slow village kid when I really shouldn't have been in bonehead math and bonehead English. But anyway, I ended up at George Washington, where I thought I might last a semester. I didn't have much money, but I managed to survive for 3 years and got my degree. But I had no plan beyond that. So by that point in time, of course, I was the longer I was away, the worse hunter I would be, right? Because I wasn't learning all the stuff I should have been learning along the way, being in boarding school and college. And so I went off to Fairbanks, and that's really when I glommed onto an issue that was going to gobble up the state for the next several years, and that was really the question of who owned Alaska.
Because you did a research paper for Jay Rabinovitz, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I had known a little bit about American Indians in the lower 48. I used to volunteer at the National Congress of American Indians when I was in college there at GW. But I had never really understood the whole picture, right? And even less so how we fit into the legal and historical scene with respect to land. And needless to say, the whole issue was exacerbated when I discovered that, we had lost our family home and land by the beach for a bottle of booze, right? And how that occurred with respect to a town site that had been surveyed that really Native people had really little to do with. We didn't understand private property very well in those days. Anyway, the long and the short of it was that research paper really gave me the chance to explore the whole Native American kind of a history with respect to the treaty arrangements between the tribes in the United States. And I began to understand why we didn't have any treaties up here in Alaska. And I was able to explore the Russian era and how few there were of them, not barely 800 of Russians at any one time in Alaska. And so I was able to explore that whole legal history, going back to the Treaty of Cession, the various organic acts, all the way up to the Statehood Act. And I came to the conclusion that, technically speaking, we still had Indian title to Alaska. It had never been extinguished. And that was a right that was only could be dealt with by the sovereign, that is the United States. And so despite all those laws, including the Statehood Act, there was never any language that extinguished our rights. But I realized that as the state began its land selection program, every time the state selected a piece of ground, and the Secretary of Interior signed off on it, that was in itself was an extinguishment. And so only to be compensable, but what I learned was that the process, the Court of Claims process and the Indian Claims Commission process was very long and very stacked against the tribes in the claimants, right? Especially when I learned that the Tlingit and Haida had spent 35 years in court for 18 million acres, and they only got $7.5 million and not a square inch of land. And so I knew that whole system was stacked against us up here. In any case, that little research paper I did gave me the tools really to get up and say something and act like I knew what I was talking about, because at that point hardly anybody knew that history at all. The general assumption was, well, okay, Congress gave us their land, and it's ours, right? And of course, needless to say, the solution had to be a congressional solution. And so that's what I was engaged in, really, with, among others, between 66 and 71.
I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from the book. Speaking of Native Americans in the lower 48, you wrote, "The result, after a mere 200 years of U.S. history, Native Americans outside Alaska had effectively lost an entire continent.
Yes.
And now occupied a total of just 50 million acres in the form of reservations. They had lost the rest of the land, nearly 2 billion acres." Mm-hmm. And then you go on to say that there seemed to be some hope in the 1959 Act of Congress admitting Alaska to the Union, because that act stated, "As a compact with the United States, the state and its people do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all rights and title to any lands of other property, including fishing rights, the right or title to which may be held by any Indians, Eskimos, or Aleuts."
Yes. It's a typical, how do I explain it? Speaking out of both sides of your mouth. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, or the government giveth and the government taketh away. So in reality, they're trying to say, okay, we're not going to take your land, but on the other hand, the Congress still authorized the selection of 103 million acres, right?
Right, but but then you say the United States had never won any land from an Alaska Native in battle.
Yep.
It had never signed any treaty with the Alaska Natives.
That's right.
Legal precedent was clear. If land had not been taken in battle or seized by an act of Congress, the federal courts had consistently found that Native Americans retained Aboriginal title.
That's right.
And that had to mean that we, the Alaska Native people, owned most of Alaska.
That's right, technically speaking. But here's an interesting point. I was actually still writing my paper the spring of '66 at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And Senator Greening, who had been territorial governor, who was then United States Senator. He was a very accomplished guy. He was a Harvard graduate. He was a medical doctor. He was a statesman. He was an author. He was everything. But he said something that really got my attention. He said something to the effect, what we have to do is we need to pay off the natives and get on with the development of this land.
You just quoted him verbatim. That's exactly what he said.
When I saw that, and I still haven't ever found the clipping again, but that really got me going, because underlying that statement was, well, number one, that natives didn't have the capability of managing land or in developing land. And on top of that, of course, he was poo-pooing our legal rights. And so I decided that was my first public act, really. I decided to write a letter to Senator Greening objecting to his comments. And then I thought, oh, well, shoot, I was at the dormitory. Heck, I like to say I didn't even have money for a bottle of beer back then. But I decided to write him a letter, and I thought, oh, shoot, it's a public issue. I'll send it to the Tundra Times, the News Miner, the Anchorage Times, and the Daily News. Well, sure enough, it got his attention, and he had a friend. He called a friend, a New Yorker, Claire Fayette. I had become a friend of theirs. She was an author and a painter, and she called me at the dorm and says, Willie, Senator Greening's come to town, and he wants to talk to you. And I thought, oh shit, he's going to take me to the woodshed,
Yeah, and just to put this in context for listeners, you're 25 years old, living in the dorm. 24. Hardly any money, just barely making ends meet.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Senator for Alaska is in Fairbanks and wants to meet with you because of what you published in the newspaper.
That's right. And so we had this set down at the old an old Nordale Hotel, gold era, rush era hotel, and just the two of us, right? And of course, back we had no AFN, then we had no Native organizations to speak of, and it was just me, a kid, and the U.S. Senator. And So he says two or three things. He said, well, Willie, he says, I'm the governor that convinced Alaska Natives to get involved in politics, and encouraged them to run. And he said, I'm the governor who supported civil rights for Alaska Natives. In the 1940s, I signed the bill to get rid of the do not hire natives or no natives allowed. And he says, on this land issue, he says, I've been trying to get the Secretary of Interior to do something about this issue, and he has done nothing. And so I had no talking points, but I said, well, Senator, I said, you did the right thing by encouraging our people to get involved in politics because we're affected by the laws like everybody else. And supporting civil rights for natives was the right thing to do. Thank you. And then I said on the land issue, I said, you're one of the big backers of statehood. And statehood, that legislation authorized the taking over of over 100 million acres of our land with no compensation, and not even a hearing as to what that meant for the transition from federal to state ownership. And I said, besides that, I said, the Secretary of Interior, he can't solve the problem. I said, that's a congressional responsibility. So we went our merry way. And so that was 2 years before he was supposed to run. So I suspected that this is a tender spot for him. And I think he knew there was some vulnerability there. But I wasn't even thinking about 2 years from now he's going to be running for the U.S. Senate again. Of course, after that meeting, I instinctively knew that he was not going to be a supporter. And he hadn't done anything really. And what he did, he was a liberal, one of the only 2 votes against the Vietnam War. He supported, birth control around the globe. But he was in the same boat with a right-wing publisher of the Anchorage Times, Bob Atwood, who himself was totally opposed to natives having any land. And I think, as I found out later, it was because when he was territorial governor, the Secretary of Interior, Ickes, over his objections, created a 1.5 million acre reservation at Venati for 19 families. And so I think that was the genesis of his concerns about Alaska Natives owning land. And so needless to say, I backed Mike Gravel when Mike came up for election in 2 years later, and he won. So
this is a moment where you were very fired up. This was an existential issue for you. And like you said, there was no AFN at the time. NANA and AFN started basically as ways of leveraging this issue. Like it was on this issue.
When I realized that, this is a very key point. When I realized that under the Statehood Act, the state was authorized to sort of describe the land it wanted to select by meets and bounds without survey, and they would make the application to the BLM, and of course it would filter up to the Secretary of Interior. I realized that when he signed that selection, that in reality was an extinguishment of our underlying right. So if we ever had a chance to get that land, which at that point nobody even thought we had a chance of getting that land, right? But I knew that extinguishment meant that our only option was this costly, laborious, slow process of the Court of Claims or Indian Claims Commission that was completely unfair. And so right then and there, I decided we had to stop the state selection process in order to protect our rights. So that's what turned me on. And so needless to say, I borrowed $50 from Helenka Bryce. Her family's still in business. She was this gravelly voiced little tough lady, and somehow I got to know her. And so she helped me buy a ticket to Kotzebue. That's when I literally was walking the streets trying to talk to anybody who would talk to me. And that's what actually resulted later on that summer in a meeting where we did form the Northwest Alaska Native Association, and we did file, I think, a 30-some million acre claim.
You knew what would be the land that you would...
I took the entire drainage area from the Noatak, Kobuk, Selwyn, and Buckland rivers, into the Kotzebue Sound.
So with regard to
And so we stopped.
creation,
We stopped the state selection, right?
yes, you did. You stopped it then.
It had, yeah.
And then you created the Alaska Federation of Natives. And I just want to point out that feels, to folks who are here now, that feels like something that's been here forever. That seems like something that makes sense.
It's like yesterday to me. Of course, I was just one of the participants. Emil, I still have his invite,
Naughty.
his invitation. Back then,
Right.
we didn't even have Xeroxes back then. We had mimeographs. People don't even know what a mimeograph is anymore, but that was the way you made copies.
Right.
Anyway, so he sent this invite, a very short one, and he actually invited me down to come a little bit early because he was feeling some pressures, and he thought there'd be maybe a dozen or 2 dozen people, but the reality was that throughout the state over the course of some years, this is only 7 years after statehood, so people were learning about the state selection process, and tribes and villages between here and Fairbanks were feeling the pressures because all this land that they had been utilizing for literally thousands of years was being chosen by the state. They were saying, hey, wait a minute. So they didn't understand the legalities and the Statehood Act and all that stuff. And so there was great concern. That's why we had so many people show up in that meeting.
Well, and the Alaska Native people, all 250 tribes have been here for about 10,000 years, but there had never been an organization representing all of them together. So this was unusual.
Too big. I mean, how would you travel? And Alaska was like a continent, and also there was lots of warfare between groups. Even within the groups, there was warfare. Right.
At the first AFN, you chaired the Land Claims Committee.
Yes.
And you wrote the position statement.
That's right.
So I just want to read a bit of that position statement. There was no public land in Alaska. Yeah. It was all native land unless there had been a previous taking by the federal government for federal use. And if there had, then we were owed compensation.
That's right. So that was our starting position based on what I had learned in my research. That yes, there were areas of land like the Tongass that had already been taken, and so my notion was that yes, we want to be compensated for those parcels, those millions of acres that may have been taken already, but we want the rest of it back. Of course, that was impossible, but it was our starting out the gate.
You also distinguished yourself from previous Native legislators because you were also running for the State House the first time, I think.
Actually, I was by August, I had already. Won the primary.
Oh, okay.
And back then, winning
the Democrat was going to win.
In November, yeah. But we specifically set up the meeting before the election so that we get some attention from the public, and it works, right?
I'll just read what you said, and then you can comment. So you said earlier Native legislators had been Americanized, accepting of the status quo, and unwilling to fight for their people's land. The new generation was different. Backed by passionate supporters, we were determined to use our youthful energy to make major changes.
I took a little flack for this, but in a sense, there was nobody standing up and saying, "Whoa, right? This is our land," and so it really was a kind of almost a generational thing because we had a whole variety of legislators from the rural areas who had been active in politics. And for whatever reason, for instance, I still don't understand why we didn't have 10 or 15 delegates to the Constitutional Convention.
Right. You wrote that there was only one Alaska Native at the Constitutional Convention who was essentially silent, and that it was really Marston, who was white, who spoke up for Native issues, but was largely ignored.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, he, with respect to land, just land, he tried to get the convention to do kind of like a homestead for Alaska Natives thing, but he was basically ignored. In fact, his book's supposed to be reprinted. In fact, I'm supposed to write a foreword for it. He really was our only champion at that time. As far as Vic Fisher was a friend of mine. He was the last living member. I served with others who were members of the Constitutional Convention, but it was almost like we were a complete blank spot up there. Even if there was just a little bit of language in the Constitution recognizing Native customs and culture and history, anything to allow the judicial system to recognize that we were here, right? But there was nothing like that whatsoever. And even the setup of the boroughs and the cities and what it was designed for basically urban Alaskans, non-natives. And so we've had to try to figure out how to use those institutions.
So you helped establish NANA, you helped establish AFN, you're very active in them, you're running for office, you're elected in November, and so you were sworn into the House in 69?
No, I was sworn in the same year Wally Hickel was sworn in as governor, January 67.
67. Okay. And that was a big year because I think you were also serving with Ted Stevens.
Oh, yeah. Ted Stevens.
Don Young.
Don Young was there. Don Young, he sat right next to me. He was a complete sacrificial lamb when he ran against Nick Begich. Nick was, by the way, my roommate.
The
father.
Right, because Nick Begich was there as well.
Yeah. Oh, there were some great legislators there. Harold Strandberg was there. Just wonderful people. And party was a factor, but we were trying to do the best we could for the state at the time.
So did those folks, were they sympathetic to your positions on native land claims?
Oh, no, we had opposition from everywhere. The territorial sportsmen were fighting us. The Alaska Miners Association was the worst, the nastiest guy. He was my neighbor, by the way. The guy who headed it. We were fighting with the business people. We were being mocked at the Chamber of Commerce conventions. We were fighting the timber people. We were even fighting the fish people, because the fish people were actually the ones who knew most about native claims, because from the beginning of the turn of the century, they were taking land for their canneries, and so they knew about Indian title. They knew that there were issues there. So yeah, we were fighting with everybody. But at the end, though, and this is a very, very key point, because the traditional system that had developed in the lower 48 was tribes and reservations. And reservations were, in reality, prisons to begin with, because you couldn't leave the reservation, right? They were a bit like the Japanese camps that were set up during war. So in any case, that was a system that non-native Alaska would never abide. That is, basically, reservations are federal control, right, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So you can't do anything as a tribe without the concurrence of the trustee, who is the federal government. That is Uncle Sam, Secretary of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So long story short, we were at loggerheads and never had any money. We couldn't bring in our 30-member board. We didn't have money for hotels. Emil barely had any money. We started doing grants just so he could have an office and pay. And we were being pressed for time. Remember, that all this happened in a 5-year period. So we were under the gun, especially when the oil was discovered in 68. So the pressure was on. And we're fighting tooth and tongue with Governor Hickel over the land freeze. And he was no shrinking violet. He was going to run over us legally or politically. It was a job, right? And our job was to try to hold the line and say, wait a minute, let's solve our problem first. Well, so what we did was we worked with Governor Hickel to set up a land claims task force.
Hey, before you get to that,
Yep.
so Stuart Udall was the Secretary of Interior in 67, and this is just part of the book that really leaped out at me. And it makes me think that you having gone to undergrad in D.C. was a huge benefit for you, of being able to have somebody to pick you up from the airport and somewhere to stay if you just suddenly crashed D.C., which it sounds like you did, because you talked about how in early 1967, Governor Hickel was meeting with Secretary Udall in Washington to decide what to do about the native land claims. And so you and
Emo
flew there all of a sudden.
We had to collect the money. We had to pass the hat to collect the money, and more or less invited ourselves to this gathering, because they were going to, the power structure was going to get together without us to try to
decide what to do about the natives.
We were there to say, wait a minute, whenever it comes to this subject, we have to be at the table. And so that was sort of...
Well, can you talk a little bit about crashing that? And like, was it really a crash? Or and by that time, did they know you were coming?
Well, I think Bartlett was pretty good. Bartlett was pretty good about letting us have him.
So Bob Bartlett, Senator Bob Bartlett.
Yeah, he knew that we were going to come.
Greening was there.
Yeah, Greening was there. Secretary of Interior was there. The whole ball of wax. Yeah. Ralph Rivers was useless.
He was the House member.
Yeah.
Who was going to ultimately be replaced by... Don Young.
Yeah.
Well, no, by Nick Begich.
No. By that time, Howard Pollock.
Okay.
Pollock. And then he was not very helpful either, sad to say. So it was great when Nick showed up.
Yeah.
And also when Egan became governor after Hickel. So it was Egan was, same generation as most of the chairmen down there, and he was ready to deal. But Wally really set the stage. Our Land Claims Task Force, which was an entire AFN board that was put into the Rural Affairs Commission so that the state could spend money. They selected the task force, which I chaired, and there was always somebody from the Native community there. There was either the Attorney General or a special counsel for the state. There was also a representative of an Assistant Secretary of the Interior named Robert Vaughn at those meetings. So it was almost like a tripartite thing. And our job was to come up with ideas to help move the state forward, because if the state was not on board, there's no bill. Mm-hmm. There's not. If the natives were divided, that's another excuse, right? If you had total conflict going on in terms of an approach. So we had to work very, very hard to keep the native community together, which was very, very difficult because we had tribes from all over the state. They all had different histories.
Who'd never worked together before.
Yeah. And so all that had consequences in the legislation. So, but what got this politically off the dime on the non-native side was our idea about, if we said we wanted 200 reservations, poof, that was a deal killer. Nobody was going to support that politically in D.C. And so when we came up with the idea...
Yeah, you wrote it. You said that after you'd written your research paper, that you instinctively understood that it was going to be easier for the federal government to offer cash for our land than the land itself.
Totally. And so we had to push very, very hard on the land side because we knew that cash was going to be easy, right? Or easier. Mm-hmm. And so when we came up with the idea of a state-chartered corporation controlled by Native people, now that was something that the state didn't see as a violation of their...
Did you come up with the idea for corporations?
We came up with it. We came up with the task force.
Okay, gotcha.
There was only about 7 of us in there. And there's an entire record. There was an entire court record of the proceedings. And like I said, there were people from the state, from the Native community, from the federal government. And then when we came with the idea of revenue sharing, right, in that process. And so all of a sudden, the whole political atmosphere changed because, number one, there was 365 million acres. There was land for the parties, right? And number two, there was also going to be a payment source because they found the oil in 1968, right? And so the state was really politically in complete need of the resolution of that issue because the state was dying on the vine because there was no revenue.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in the book that folks don't really understand. You wrote that we were going to have to rescind statehood. Well, like if we hadn't had the oil come in and built a pipeline, then Alaska was absolutely non-viable as a state.
Of course, the reason that the Congress was trying to steal 103 million of our 8 million acres of our land was the state was supposed to use that to survive, to lease and sell a course of time. But of course, that sort of thing takes a lot of time. You got to find the resources first, right? Mm-hmm. And so at that point, like I said, Governor Egan was running the state like the grocery owner that he was, nickel and diming, because we couldn't afford the little government we had at that point, right? And so the discovery of that oil, the necessity for the pipeline and the right-of-way actually gave us some leverage, right, in getting Congress to deal with the issue, because we knew damn well that if they got the right-of-way to build a pipeline, there'd never be a land settlement, right? And so our goal was to get the land settlement resolved. And so Udall, who was our hero, who'd instituted the land freeze that stopped the state selections for us and put the pressure on the Congress really to try to get the issue solved. Mm-hmm. He's really a hero in my opinion, although he was the most hated guy in the urban areas, but he took a tough stand because he was a trustee. Remember, he was a trustee of all the reservations, but he was also our trustee, but it was one of those gray area issues where I think he began to realize that as he starts signing, the land request by the state, that we were losing our control of that land, right? And so that land freeze really helped, and it became a big issue when Nixon won the election, and Wally, he was going to choose Wally Hickel as the Secretary of Interior. So we knew damn well that Wally's job was going to be to go down to D.C., get rid of that land freeze and build that pipeline, and the hell with the natives. And so we fought like crazy to make it an issue, and we did. We were, Emil Nadi, myself, John Borbridge, and Eben Hobson, went to Washington, D.C. as almost the whole state was just dying for Wally to become the secretary because they wanted the pipeline. And even our own native position was being eroded. Some of our directors were actually agreeable to him becoming secretary without a commitment on the freeze. But the four of us went down there, and we couldn't get satisfaction from Governor Hickel during the hearing process. And finally, we had to go to the Hill to Senator Jackson and to the Democrats, and they put it to Wally. He knew he was vulnerable. The Democrats thought that that was one cabinet member that they could wipe out, that Nixon had selected, and so Wally realized his job was on the line, and so he finally conceded that he wouldn't do anything with the land freeze without coming to the Senate. So in reality, from a legal standpoint, that was there's a line there between the executive and the legislative, right? And it got crossed in a sense because he had every right to do that, right? But he promised that he wouldn't without coming to them, and of course that gave the Senate and House the time to actually come up with. So the onus really was put on themselves, really, that is the Congress, to resolve the issue.
You made this a national issue with the Mike Wallace story from 60 Minutes when he was in Kotzebue.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, can you talk about doing 60 Minutes?
Yeah, of course, we didn't have TV back then. I hardly knew anything about 60 Minutes, but I think I knew about him. But in any case, it was about the oil, really. He thought it was about the oil, so he came up to do an oil story. Well, then when he got here, he realized that really the question was really who owns that oil? Whose land is it, right? So he completely changed courses, and apparently he tried to fly into Barrow, and it was foggy, it was spring, and he couldn't land there, so he directed his pilot to fly to Kotzebue, and I just happened to be in town. And I don't know how he tracked me down, but he wanted to interview me. And like I said, none of us had any talking points, so I was just there flying on my own, but just trying to tell the story the best I could. But I was very impressed with him. So at that point, we needed national attention. I mean, if you're going to pass legislation, national legislation, you got to have people behind you, right? People have to be for you. And so later on, actually, like I said, the land claims are just one of the things I was trying to do. I was in the legislature. I got involved with electrification.
I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about you sending Mike Wallace to your neighbor's house. Yes. Yeah, you sent him to Elmer and Laura Davis's
Elmer and
house.
Laura, and I remember them so well, yeah. They were I lived in a little, sort of a tar paper shack there. There's even more of a tar paper shack, just a little ways over there. They had come in from another village, I forget where.
Sellewick.
And anyway, he had cobbled together a home, and anyway, I was just totally surprised when they allowed Mike and his cameraman to come in there.
Because to point out, they're not college educated.
Oh God, are you kidding? No
school.
way. They're traditional folk. Yep. They speak in Yupat, and they were having a lunch of some dried caribou or something, and of course neither of them had any Western type knowledge of the history of the law of anything, But by God, when Mike asked his wife, he says, "Who owns this house, this land? Who owns this house?" She says, "He does." He says, she deferred to Elmer, and he said, "So Elmer," he says, "Elmer, do you own this house? Do you own the land under the house?" He said, "Do you have a piece of paper?" "No."
He said, "Yes, we own the land."
Yeah.
No, we don't have the paper.
That's right. So that was, of course, the whole point, right?
That's 100,000 Alaskan natives.
Everybody felt that this is their traditional territory, thousands of years of being here. But do we have a piece? No. So he made
the point.
Yeah, that's right, and I always appreciated that.
And you said that in 2005 you visited Senator Ted Stevens' office, and he had a picture of Laura and Elmer Davis on his wall.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Actually, I knew Ted before I actually got to the legislature, so we served together. He was running for office one of those times. I just met him. I worked for Edith Bullock. She was a tug and barge lady, and She was a Republican, and she was, of course, helping Ted. As before I even knew about politics. In fact, he encouraged me. We talked on the beach, and I was thinking about trying to go to college at GW, and he encouraged me to go to GW.
Go to West Coast.
Yeah. Of course, when I came back, just 3 years later, I graduated. And there we were serving together, and sort of fighting. We always got along, though.
So you mentioned electrification. So in addition to working so hard to get NANA up and going, working so hard to get AFN up and going, being a new legislator who was running new legislation, passing legislation, I'll just mention at the time, Alaska Natives weren't allowed to be in pioneer homes.
That's right.
And you overturned that.
Yeah, it was. There was a specific language in the statute basically saying that any Alaska Native receiving aid from the U.S. government is hereby excluded, or something to that effect. And so if you got any kind of dough, like maybe money from Social Security or something, you couldn't. So it was basically, I mean, I understand it. But, the whole territorial setup, the whole statehood setup, it was set up for non-Native people, right? We were an afterthought, right? And so that was a leftover of sort of a colonial period, right? And at that point in time, there was no elder programs of any kind, really. So the Pioneers' Home was the only facility for people who needed a place to stay. And so I had to get rid of that language. And then somehow I ended up on a conference committee on a Pioneers' Home bond bill. Back in those days, we had no cash. So if you were going to build anything, you had to pass a bond. It had to be statewide, right? And so what they do is, if they wanted roads, they'd say, roads for Anchorage, X amount, X for roads for Fairbanks, X roads or whatever for Southeast. Maybe they'll pass a ferry bond or something. And then for the bush, they usually stuck Nome in there. And so, but I got a Pioneers' Home for Kotzebue, and of course we had no pioneers. But that's the way. But what we did was, if we ran it as a Pioneers' Home, it was going to be very expensive because you had to have, registered nurses and blah blah blah. And so, but the Health and Social Service contracted it to Maniluk, which is our nonprofit, which was the old Northwest Alaska Native Association that I had created. And so we were able to turn it into a Native thing, right? So we could serve our own food. We didn't have to live by those state rules, and we could hire our own people who knew the language, and it really was a great facility. We called it a senior center, not a Pioneers' Home. But so that was just one of those issues. I mean, I had battles with pioneers, so to speak. I had battles with the liquor industry. I had battles with the labor.
Well, you know what? I will talk about liquor really fast, because you did two things. One that I would think was almost, you allowed nonprofits to be able to sell liquor in rural Alaska.
Yeah.
Because what was happening is that these, I guess, outside companies were coming in and making a profit.
Well, here's the deal. Of course, liquor has been an issue. I mean, in Russia, the state issued licenses, to traders to sell vodka. It really was a profit center for the nation, and they encouraged alcohol, right? I mean, vodka for everything.
For the state.
Yeah, that's right. And so up here in Alaska, of course, in the territorial days and early statehood days, I mean, the liquor industry was powerful because they had money and they had cash and they supported politicians and they set the rules through the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board, right? So getting on that board was a real perk, that if you were close to the governor and they protected their industry. Well, in rural Alaska, they had a gradation, I mean, by population, X number of people would have X number of bar licenses, X number of restaurant licenses, X number of beer and wine licenses, X number of package stores. Well, anyway, Kotzebue, Yakutat were two places, and there was one other that set up a nonprofit in the community to try to keep the money in town and also to control the disposition, right? They just keep limited hours, but any income they would use for local projects like playgrounds and other things. When I got to Juneau, the industry got the Attorney General to declare that, in an opinion, that there was no statutory basis for these nonprofits. So I had to get a bill passed to continue to allow those communities to have that choice, as opposed to a place like Nome, where liquor has always been a part of that gold mentality, where there were zillions of bars, that had been historically licenses that had been issued. But in Kotzebue, there was a point in time there where they sort of got rid of the nonprofit one, and all of a sudden we had 2 or 3 bars, we had beer and wine outlets, we had package stores, and people were going nuts with booze. And finally, the town voted
To get rid of them.
by 20 votes, shut them down. And then, and when as a consequence, within a half a year period, almost every category of crime went down. So I remember I was NANA president at the time. Me and Robert Newland, who was our chairman, we actually went house to house, encouraging people to vote to
Get rid of that.
yeah. But right now they have, I think, just an outlet that the municipality controls.
The other alcohol bill you did was no booze for bigots, and that was against the Elk,
God.
Club.
I took a lot of crap for that. I wasn't looking for a fight. It's just that to me it just wasn't fair that we had organizations that didn't allow brown people to be members, and Elks clubs and other clubs. Anyway, so what I realized was the only reason these places were in business because of a state liquor license, and so I sponsored a bill to prevent the issuance of a state license to any organization that discriminated against, blacks, brown, whatever. Needless to say, it got bottled up. But then when the Ketchikan Airport was built, it was sort of out of town, and they had to change, Senator Ziegler had to change the liquor law to allow a bar at the new airport site. So his bill went sailing through the Senate, and so I attached my bill to his bill as an amendment, and the shit hit the fan, So that's how the no booze for bigots came. It just became a statewide thing, And eventually what they did was they I think even the Democrats were torqued off in a way because they were members of the Elks clubs and stuff, and so they said, well, when the Supreme Court votes, we'll comply. Well, of course, they'd have to comply. And of course, eventually it was found to be discriminatory. So anyway, that was my battle I had.
So you've got these intense battles happening with legislation. You're also working on NANA. You're also working on AFN. You were also part of AVEC, so the Alaska Village Electric Co-op. You were elected president.
Yeah.
And you're working on bringing electricity to villages that have never had electricity before. You're doing all of this at the same time. It's just impossible for me to wrap my head around.
I had no job. I had time. Anyway, of course, I grew up, really in almost more traditional than almost anybody left, in the sense that we lived in 3 different sod homes at Iġġiaġruk and up in Kimmickbook. We'd go to our tar paper shack in Kotzebue, when we needed to. But we found it living a lot easier out in the country because there was timber, there was lots of driftwood, there was lots of alders. We didn't have to compete because Kotzebue has no timber. And also you had to have income to buy coal or heating oil. And out there, we just lived off the land. And so, but we used Coleman lamps or kerosene lamps or candles. And once in a while, when you had nothing else, you could use seal oil like we used to for light. Anyway, so when I got back and I was running for the House in 66, when I was 24, I think I was going actually from Guyana to Narvik out by boat. And I was thinking, nothing has changed in 10 years. I said, and I was thinking that, I was concerned about costs even then. I was thinking to myself, well, the family has to buy the Coleman lamp. That Coleman lamp had a little generator that would wear out. You'd have to change that. That cost a little bit. Mm-hmm. Then the mantles were like a piece of ash, right? They were made out of asbestos, and when you lit them, it was very delicate, and so you had to keep spending money on mantles because you'd actually punch a hole in it, and then you had to buy the gasoline or kerosene. So I was thinking to myself, well, maybe even $20 a month, you could have 2 bulbs, kids could read. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote a letter to Senator Bartlett, and little did I know was that they had been a joint study between the poverty program and the Electrification Administration, a statewide study. And it was sitting there actually. And so, but of course they had no funding really set up to get a group together. So they went to the state. Wally, in those days, every dollar that came from the federal government, the governor wanted to control. So he would be, recognized as the guy who was directing the money, right, and getting the political benefit. Well, so to this very day, I don't know how I got elected president of AVEC, because Morris Thompson was on there. He worked for Wally. There was Jimmy Hoffman from Bethel. He was a Republican, nice guy, pilot. And myself, Diane Carpenter, I think she might have been a D. But there was another guy from Juneau who's a non-native, who was a Republican. So to this very day, I still don't know how I got elected president. But I worked very well with all of them, and including Wally. And so we really, really had to work hard to get the federal government to give us that $5 million. It was a lot of money in those days. And they took one look at that study and they thought, holy shit, this part of the world is on a non-Western economy, It's
right. But I mean, you did a really good job of showing that this is exactly what the purpose of this type of money is for.
On that point, I got invited to the National
Rural Electric Cooperative.
To give a speech to thousands of people in New Jersey. What's that place where?
Atlantic City.
Atlantic City. Anyway, so I gave a rip-roaring speech, just putting the heat on, because they weren't willing to give the money. And by God, we got the money. But while I was in D.C., it was about the time that Wally Hickle's name was bandied about, and I got a call from the Good Morning America to see if I would come and be on their show. Well, like I said, we still didn't have TV up north, but I finally realized as I was sitting there being interviewed by Hugh Downs that I was talking to millions of people, millions of people. And I knew what they wanted. They wanted something controversial about Uncle Wally. Well, I didn't want to piss him off, right? He was just coming into office. And so I don't even remember what I said, but I was probably speaking out of both sides of my mouth like a politician does, because I knew that, we had big battles with him, over the land freeze and about the pipeline. But at the same time, if he got confirmed, then we'd have to deal with him. So I was trying to be as fair as I could.
What I had like a little epiphany while I was reading this section of the book, because something that comes up a lot in the legislature today is that PCE does not apply to schools in villages. And I've always been very confused about that. So you could correct me if I'm wrong, but at the time, BIA ran the schools.
Yes.
And they had their own generators.
Yes.
And part of the way that you were going to electrify these villages was you needed...
Totally.
So
that was a big victory.
So getting the BIA's generators turned off was very important.
Absolutely.
And I think, and so in my mind, I was like, hey, you know what? I think that this might actually have some carryover to today. And it's why PCE doesn't apply to schools, is that the whole purpose when we were electrifying the villages was to help the people at home.
Yeah, we needed a big user. In fact, before AVEC, I remember going into the villages. I mean, the school and the school teachers' home, they were all bright lit up, 24 hours a day, right? And the village in the dark, right? And so actually getting them as a user was very, very key to our economic plan out there. But I'm very concerned about the cost of electricity out there. We are probably the highest in the nation, and it's not getting any better. And that's just one of the concerns that I have about the sustainability of our communities out there. But somehow we have to try to figure out ways to minimize the cost of electricity, or if our communities are going to be viable.
So getting back to talking about ANCSA, in 1967, President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointed you to the National Council on Indian Opportunity.
Oh my God, you're the only one in Alaska who's even stated that even knows about it.
Well, it leaps off the page at me that you were the first Alaska Native to sit on that National Council of Indian Opportunity.
There has never been anything like it ever again. In retrospect, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but the reason I was on there was, of course, I was a legislator, but I was also friends with LaDonna Harris. LaDonna Harris was the wife of Senator Fred Harris, and she had clout in the Indian world. And I think she she probably, I don't know I never researched the history of the NCIO, but her husband probably modeled it after AIO, which is Americans for Indian Opportunity. That was her nonprofit. But the key here was that every secretary of every department that had a
was
Indian
meeting there.
program,
I was going to say George Shultz, the Secretary of Labor,
yeah.
Donald Rumsfeld was there,
yeah.
and it was chaired by the Vice President of the United States.
Right.
And so when it went to Nixon, it was Spiro T. Agnew who was the chair of the committee that you were serving on. So you were in their ears.
Yes, that I appreciated all the programs, but my goal was to make sure that the land claims was front and center, and they had Indian leadership that from all over the U.S. Half a dozen of us, right? And I happen to be one of. In fact, I could have brought to you my plaque that's signed by Johnson that's hanging in my garage. But there has never been anything like that created since. We had one meeting with Spiro Agnew. I remember shaking his hand. It was quite effeminate, actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then we had a meeting with Hubert Humphrey. He was sickly. He had a little bit of a sniffle, so we met at his condo, actually. Yeah, but he's one. He was just a wonderful person to deal with. But that was quite an experience. When Nixon got elected, of course, my term was up. So, but it was an amazing experience being involved at that level, because all the
and again, just to point it out to people, and you were 26 years old.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, I was just a learner. I was just flying by the seat of my pants, doing the best I could, and trying to make sure that Alaska and Alaska Natives were front and center on programs, et cetera, and especially those people who had the power to direct funds.
In the end, the bill that passed, that was signed by President Nixon, created the 12 regional corporations, the village corporations. It went to approval before he signed it by AFN.
Actually, he may have already signed it. I'm not sure the sequence, but he did speak. In fact, Abby's uncle was Pat Ryan.
Abby's uncle is also Wally Hickle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, we were kind of family, but that didn't mean that we didn't battle, right? We battled like crazy. It was a little strange at times. But her mother was Irma Lee Hickle's sister. But on her dad's side, he had a brother named Pat. Pat, in fact, he's still alive. He's in his 90s right now. But he was always a chief of staff to Wally when he was governor and when he was Secretary of Interior. Now, Pat claims that he was the one that set up the opportunity for Nixon to speak to us at the convention when he talked about when we were at APU. Where he announced that he had signed the legislation. Needless to say, it was almost like a bitter pill in a sense. I mean, I don't recall a celebration because we were successful in getting a bill. Subsistence had dropped out of it somehow. And to this day, I don't know who dropped it. But at the same time, we had secured something that was unprecedented in Native American history in this country, where 40 million acres and $1 billion, that compared to where we started. In some of our most ardent, powerful supporters back east, they were ready to agree to something a hell of a lot less than we got, right? But at the same time, we knew what we were giving up. I mean, we were maybe getting 10% of our former land holdings, but still it was the biggest settlement ever in this country with the Native American people. And also it is, in a sense, it's all those business types and miners and all those people that we fought that didn't understand what we were actually accomplishing. We were doing more for the economic and capitalistic system than anybody ever remotely thought, right? And of course, we weren't interested in that aspect. That we had to get the land. That was what we were after. But of course, as a minority, you don't control the process. So but look what's happened. I mean, we had nothing to begin with. We barely owned a mechanic shop in those old days. And now here, all of a sudden, we have a key place in the economy up here in Alaska, which we would never have had without the settlement.
Yeah, you had a really good section talking about just what was being expected of folks who
had not really interacted with money, period, all of a sudden had to become very astute business people. Starting from the barest of beginnings, we had to comprehend the very nature of business and to understand the responsibilities we had as directors, officers, and shareholders of the corporations. We had to master the day-to-day work of strategizing, coming up with ideas, implementing and managing them. Along the way, we had to learn about matters that had never before concerned our people. Depreciation, life estate stock, foreign currency fluctuations. But we did it.
Yep, we did. And it's really amazing.
You even said that at that time, you said when I got my first mortgage in 1975, I thought it meant I had to live in the house for 30 years. You were giving that as an example.
But not only that, but a few years later, I actually organized a bank, United Bank Alaska. I was chairman of the board. Unfortunately, it didn't make it through the catastrophe of the late 80s when oil prices fell down to $9 a barrel or something.
Hey, I want to ask a couple of controversial questions really fast before you go. But so one thing I've learned from the current House Rep for Kotzebue and Iġġiaġruk is that, she says, I'm the only representative who has 2 large hub communities in my district. And that's different than any other community. What I noticed in the book, having seen a little bit of the rivalry between North Slope and Northwest Arctic, is that you talk a lot about helping the North Slope.
Well, I worked there. I worked very closely with him. Eben Hobson and he was a different generation than I was, but, we appreciated each other's skills and capabilities. I helped him, in the formation of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. He called them, actually, they were disorganized. And I helped, I felt like I was his prime minister, right? And trying to make sure things.
And by the way, just for listeners, we don't have time to talk about it, but the Circumpolar Conference is so important. And it was, an international group of people from Greenland and Canada and Alaska, basically the indigenous people around the Arctic, around the world coming together. And you were instrumental.
I actually, I don't know if people know this, but, there was always a schism in the community in Barrow. Between the different families, different whaling families, and I picked that up right away in my 20s. There's long before the borough, before the corporations, what little power structure, there was already people vying for influence back then, and I had to navigate all that as a youngster, and but I sensed it right away, and so I tried to kind of. You talk to one guy and then you maybe talk to his arch enemy over there, but you sort of better know it. And I think I did everything I could to make sure that the borough got formed. The oil industry wasn't happy about it. The state wasn't that happy about it because they wanted to be the one that taxed, the properties, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, when I first ran, I hardly knew anybody up there. And of course, I didn't actually think I was going to win. My goal was to talk to people about land because that was the issue that, to me, was front and center. And even if I didn't win, that was fine. At that time, there was no Nuiqsut, there was no Otqusuk, there was just Barrow, Browerville, and so we had the main population in the Kotzebue region. And what I did do, though, was I got the support of Dan Lisburn from Point Hope. Dan was the mayor, and he worked for the BIA at the time. But
hey, I just had to point Hope really fast, just again for listeners. You worked for Project Chariot. This is crazy.
I had a whole chapter called "My Nuclear Years." that got cut down to a couple paragraphs.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, Project Chariot was going to, they were going to send off nuclear bombs to create a harbor.
Yeah, I worked at Cape Thompson and Cannikin.
Wow.
But of course, at that point, I didn't know. I was a driller's aide on that project.
But you make a funny joke, even in the paragraphs that they kept in, that the reason why Project Chariot didn't go forward is because you were so slow.
No, we screwed up the holes. I was on the drilling crew. It was very poorly funded. The other one had zillions of dollars. This one was a poorly funded operation, and Quonset, cloth Quonset huts, and a little generator and a place to eat. I have pictures of myself on the crown of the drilling rig, And I thought that was the biggest drilling rig I ever seen in my life. But the reality was that drilling rig was nothing more than a water well drilling rig on wheels.
Oh.
It didn't have the power to open up these chambers that we had. I think there were 8 holes we were supposed to drill, 6 or 8, I can't remember. But we were supposed to drill down and do 2 chambers. We were supposed to use pressure to open up these teeth to do this chamber and then go down and then do another chamber.
And were they going to put the nuclear bombs inside
Yes.
there? Okay.
Yes. Anyway, long and short of it was, when I got there, I didn't know. To me, back in those days, we believed in the government. Whatever the government does, yeah. And anyway, I didn't know it was a nuclear project, actually. But I learned after that what it was. I was making $2.80 an hour or something. I was working from 6 at night till 6 in the morning on the drilling crew. And I actually dropped a tool I stopped the program for about 4 days. That's enough to get you fired anywhere else, right? But Jack Tedrow, the guy who ran the operation, he liked me, so he didn't fire me. But that was a summer job.
Anyway, I distracted you. You were talking about somebody from Point Hope.
Oh, Dan Lisburn.
Lisburn.
Dan. I wanted his support, and I let him know it.
When you were running for office.
Yeah, and I was in my 20s, and he invited me to come to Point Hope. Well, he literally kind of queried me, interrogated me for like 2 days before he finally agreed, and he took me to every house. Mm-hmm. I got great support out of Point Hope. And then, so when I decided to go to Point Hope, I paid his way to come with me because he was older generation. He knew people up there, and I hardly knew anybody, right? And so I figured I needed about 100 votes, at least 25% of the votes. And so I got about 98 out of 400. Johnny Dusinginia was a local favorite. But with those 100 votes plus all, I sailed through the primary. Mm-hmm. There were half a dozen of us in the race, but I won the primary hands down. And then, of course, then 2 years later, actually, Evan Hobson ran against me. And Dan Lisburn decided to support him because it's saying, what are we sending that young whippersnapper down there for, But I beat them both. But I wasn't even running. I was running, but I was in...
Oh, well, you ran for Senate.
I was running. I was actually in law school at the University of New Mexico, an Indian pre-law program, the summer of '68, when I should have been up there. But I won anyway.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't run for the Senate till 70.
Okay, you ran 66, 68, and then you ran for the Senate in 70.
Yeah.
And then in 74, you ran against Don Young.
Yep.
You were really careful to only say nice things about Don Young. I mean,
we weren't nasty back then, like they are today. I still am very proud of that vote because I had spent 8 years basically fighting with the urbanites, right, with my rural. And so when I got 46%, I thought that was damn good.
Yeah.
For having no money to speak of. And of course, in retrospect, I think the worst thing that would have happened is that I spent the rest of my life in Washington. Right? Yeah. So Don and I always got along. Yeah.
Well, we have talked about anxiety. This is really important that we talked about all of this, but I really want to talk about what I think is so much more important in the book itself is about your early life and your values and just your commitment to preserving a Iñupiaq culture. Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to do a second episode.
Okay, that's fine.
Can you read from your book? I was going to have you read a few paragraphs just to end us.
Absolutely.
Like starting with the rage.
Yes. Okay. The rage of my youth was rooted in ignorance of my history. I did not understand the colonial mentality. I knew nothing about the role of religion in controlling human beings in areas beyond the spiritual. In our case, the predation on family ties, the denigration of our language and cultural practices. I didn't know about economic oppression and advantage. I didn't know about class systems and snobbery. I didn't recognize the role of the classroom in obliterating cultural identity and traditional knowledge. In the end, you have to understand the times you live in and the mentality of those whose decisions affect you. The missionaries had been motivated both by zealous self-righteousness and plain old dollar signs. To be fair, they worked hard to provide health care and sanitation and to set us on what they saw as the path to heaven. But they never really understood us, and abetted by the federal government, they made decisions that should have been made by our own people, using their power to repress our ability to govern ourselves. Our parents and grandparents acquiesced in all this and gave us to the system in the belief that they were offering us a better life. What they didn't understand was that it was possible to retain our souls, our identity, our culture, and still pick up enough of the Western ways to flourish in the new order. Iñupiat Ilpuset opened my eyes. Now we had a new way of looking at our continuing struggle. It wasn't enough to claim our lands. We had to claim our ways of thinking, acting, and living. The ways my mother Nonrorek and her elderly friends and relations instilled in me, and that taught me patience, the ability to withstand pain and deprivation without self-pity, and the camaraderie of a common effort. This was the true spirit of our people, and this was what was being resurrected. We are the descendants of people who learned to take what the conditions offered us and thrive. That was the spirit that guided our families, clans, tribes, and nations. It is a spiritual force deeply embedded in our people, and it is just as important in the rapidly changing world we now inhabit as it was when all Alaska belonged to Native peoples. The stronger our identity and spirit, the stronger the likelihood that we'll keep our land for future generations. Iñupiat Ilikuset must not be allowed to fade. Our elders and our grandchildren are counting on us.
So good.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Willie Hensley, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I have to have you back.
Okay.
And thanks for everything you've done for Alaska.
You betcha. No problem. I was lucky to be here. Yep. There you go.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklec.gov or call 907-269-0123.